With me is Arun Kundani. He's adjunct professor at New York University. He's just written The Muslims Are Coming. Arun, welcome. Our mayor makes announcements about the fact that Muslim children should be taken into care for fear of radicalization. What was your first response to that?
Well, the first thing is the kind of factual premise behind it is totally false. So the idea that the children of extremists are likely to become extremists themselves just doesn't stand up. If you look at all of the cases of actual terrorists, they've become terrorists in spite of their parents' influence, not because of it. But beyond that, I mean, I think the idea of splitting up families, taking children from their parents, putting them into some kind of state institution, because of the ideas that the parents have, because of the ideology the parents have, is shocking, and it goes against basic principles of how you're meant to protect the interests of children. And
yet, more people weren't shocked. Obviously, someone like Boris Johnson over here in London is a populist politician, so he obviously thinks he's hitting some kind of chord. He's previously said young Muslims infected by the Islamist virus. Presumably people like that, otherwise he wouldn't be saying things like that.
Well, these kind of statements have become banal now, right? They're just not seen as shocking at all. And the reason for that is because we've had probably about 20 years now of so-called terrorism experts and officials and pundits and commentators telling us a kind of theory of why terrorism happens that is basically false, but has been circulated time and time again. And it's exactly this idea that Boris Johnson invokes when he talks about this idea of a virus of extremism circulating amongst young people. The idea is that some set of bad ideas is the root cause of terrorism. But all the evidence suggests that isn't the case, and that actually terrorism, the kind of ultimate root cause of terrorism, is political. It's to do with, ultimately the foreign policies of our own government.
And of course, when people do raise that, they say, "Oh, you're just excusing the terrorists." Your book very clearly traces the new generation of Islamification. I don't know what the right word is. Just tell me a little bit about that. That it's not that radicalization and terrorism are not the same.
Right, so we've in the last kind of 10 years, we've had this concept of radicalization emerge, right, particularly from the kind of security officials, the world of counterterrorism. And the idea of radicalization is that you can be turned from being an ordinary Muslim in a Western society into a terrorist just by coming across certain ideas and an ideology, right? And the reality is that if you look at things that way, you're just ignoring the kind of wider picture of the political contexts that generate political violence and terrorism.
And I know you look at Oldham, perhaps in particular in the book, and talk about that generational difference of why children are getting, another generation's getting into Islam, as it were.
Right. I mean, if you look at the history of some of these communities, we have communities that have migrated historically from Pakistan and Bangladesh and India, for example. And if you go back to the early 1980s, the way that people looked for solutions to the kinds of political injustices they were experiencing in their lives, whether it was kind of racist violence on the street or institutional racism in policing or kind of issues to do with immigration policy, people at that time turned to a kind of secular radical leftism, right, that maybe had come from the Black Panther Party in the United States or been inspired by the kind of anti-colonial movements in the Indian subcontinent. And at that time, in the context of the Cold War, the fear was that this kind of left-wing radicalization was infecting young Asians in Britain, right? And the government at that time actually preferred the kind of conservative Islam that it actually sponsored as a kind of rival set of community voices.
So you're talking, so there's racism, neo-colonialism, as it were, and these are the factors that
right. I mean, I think if you want to understand, if you look at the biographies of the 7/7 bombers, right, from 2005, if you want to understand how they ended up feeling that it was legitimate for them to commit this act of mass murder on their fellow civilians, you have to, you can talk about their religious ideology, and that's a part of the picture, but you have to also look at the wider political context, the racism in the society they've grown up in, and the Iraq War is a huge factor here, right? So, if you look at the terrorism statistics, from 2003, when the Iraq War starts, to 2006, the number of terrorist convictions more than doubles in Britain. Then by 2009, it goes down again to what it was before, right? The only way to make sense of that is to think about that context of foreign policy. We have millions of people come out onto the streets in 2003 to protest against the impending Iraq War, calling for Britain not to be involved in it. A lot of people are optimistic. They think that in a democratic society, that number of people on the streets is bound to pressure the government to withdraw from this. It doesn't happen. In that context of a kind of political failure in our society and a political defeat, actually, it's exactly the kind of context that historically, time and time again, we see giving rise to terrorism.
And it's those precise liberals that were on that demonstration that are horrified by 7/7, well, we're all horrified by 7/7 and so on, that have also started to say, look, this dangerous radicalization in these communities, it must be stopped. The mosques preaching hate.
Right. I think it's been much more comfortable.
But that is the case.
I think it's been much more comfortable for a lot of liberals to think that this is all the result of some kind of crazy alien religious ideology, than actually to face up to, the role that that actually our politics and this society's politics has caused. Right, it's easier to blame religion than politics here, and that's I think been a large part of why liberals have focused in on this concept of radicalisation.
And you make the case, as if it need to be made, but it probably does, that Islam and the state, those relations, because that's the thing you'll see in The Guardian or the independent newspapers, the left-leaning, certainly the Labour Party people, that there is kind of something problematic about Islam as a religion.
Right.
It doesn't understand state and jurisprudence.
Yeah, so this is I mean, the kind of the standard narrative that you get from liberals is that, and conservatives, is that Islam, by its very nature, is a religion that will not constrain itself to the private sphere, but it always wants to take over the political sphere, take over the state. It doesn't have, the kind of church-state separation that Western liberalism is supposed to value, right? The reality is that there's always been going back more than 1,000 years, there's been de facto separation of religion and politics in Islam. Right?
Just 1,000 years, then.
Just 1,000 years, yeah. But more importantly, how people, you can't understand religion by thinking about some kind of core essence to it that kind of always plays out time and time again. So this is the mistake that liberals tend to make, is they think, okay, here's Islam and it's always the same, and it just kind of corrupts people into behaving in certain ways. Whereas how Islam gives you a broad moral framework, but how you actually apply it depends on the context you're in, right? And in a political context of, think about the Middle East in the 20th century, the political context of all kinds of injustices taking place. People obviously try and mobilize their religious belief system in order to try and make sense of that, right? And so it's for me, the religion isn't really the ultimate cause here. What's the ultimate cause is the political context.
And the standard argument is that if you start to talk about foreign policy, you're excusing the people that beheaded Lee Rigby.
Right. If we want to create a society where we don't have a problem of terrorism, we need to understand what causes it, right? And we can't do that if, as soon as we ask questions about causation, we get into this thing of any possible attempt to explain causation inevitably implies excusing it, right? That's just not going to get us anywhere. And obviously, individually, anyone who uses violence against civilians has to be, absolutely condemned, right? But if we're going to do that without hypocrisy, we also need to condemn the violence against civilians that states carry out as well, right? And so, I find my position much more consistent morally and much more intellectually and morally responsible than people who take the view that we just need to think of terrorism as this kind of morally reprehensible act and stop the conversation there.
But there's no way any 90% of, well, certainly mainstream media will ever define terrorism as the actions in Iraq. So terrorism will be confined to 7/7 and the killers of Lee Rigby.
Right, absolutely. And the word terrorism is always involved. It's an inherently political term, right? It always involves a political choice of saying certain kinds of violence are unacceptable and to be morally condemned, but then kind of in the background there's other kinds of violence that are just considered rational, normal and necessary, and so we don't talk about those, even if by any objective definition of terrorism they would also count as terrorism. You know, the kind of standard definition of terrorism is the killing of civilians for political ends, right? And so by that definition, the thousands of civilians who are killed in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia by drone strikes are also victims of terrorism.
Arun Kundnani, thank you.
Thank you very much.